Oyez, oyez, oyez. I call the Space Court Foundation video series to order. My name is Nathan Johnson, and I am the co-founder and executive director of the Space Court Foundation. On behalf of ourselves and our co-hosts at Secure World Foundation, who have also sponsored today's closed captioning, I'd like to thank you for joining us for our video series on reducing space threats of resolution. The Space Court Foundation is a 501c3 educational nonprofit corporation that promotes and supports space law policy and education and the rule of law. The Space Court Foundation produces educational materials and scholarship through the administration of two major projects, Stellar Decisis and the Space Court Law Library. The Foundation engages in partnerships and collaborations that help grow greater awareness of space law and how disputes in space may be resolved as humans venture further from Earth in the not too distant future. For more information about our mission, programming, and internship programs, we ask that you visit our website at spacecourtfoundation.org. If you enjoy our programming, you can support us by becoming a patron on our brand new Space Court Foundation Patreon page, offering multiple levels of monthly subscriptions with a variety of benefits that offer pre-release content and exclusive ways to get involved with our work. You can also support us by purchasing Space Court Foundation merchandise online at Celestial Objections Apparel, available on our website. We offer clothing, accessories, and decor with proceeds going to support our nonprofit. And finally, I invite you to check out all of our videos on the Space Court Foundation's YouTube channel. We produce content every month on important topics relating to the rules that govern space activities. Please remember to subscribe and follow us on social media for the latest updates. Our moderator today is Daniel Porras. Daniel serves as the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Communications at the Secure World Foundation. Previously, Daniel served as the Space Security Fellow at the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, where he focused on political and legal issues surrounding space security. He was the resident technical expert for multiple UN bodies working on space security issues, including the Group of Governmental Experts on Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space. And recently, Daniel joined the board of directors for the Space Court Foundation and has been an invaluable supporter of the foundation from the beginning. Thank you again, Daniel, for putting this excellent program together.
Thank you so much, Nathan. I really appreciate it. And welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's early for some, late for others, but it's wonderful that we're all able to come together during this sort of virtual period of our world. Just wanted to thank a few folks real quick as we're kicking things off, in particular Space Court Foundation for giving us this platform, and in particular my producer, Letitia Zarkin. She's absolutely invaluable, and we wouldn't be able to put all these events together without her. I also want to thank Secure World Foundation, and many thanks also for the closed captioning. If anybody is interested, you can turn on the closed caption function down here where it says more, and it's got the three little breadcrumbs. And also thank you very much to the UK mission for agreeing to do this event with us, to Ambassador Aidan Liddle, who's going to be speaking with us today, and of course to Simon Clawbury, who is always very helpful in helping us to work together with the UK government. Today's event is really near and dear to my heart, mostly because, as many of you all know, I focus a lot on space security, and so I was delighted to hear that the UK government was putting forward a new initiative at the United Nations to look at space security and how we might be able to deal with some of the challenges and threats that are occurring. Just to give a little bit of context, for about 40 years, we've had an agenda item at the UN called the Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space. And as some of you have probably already heard me and many of my other colleagues here today talk about, there are some really worrying trends that we're seeing in terms of the development of not what is an arms race in outer space, but there is an arms race potentially happening, and outer space is simply a part of it. The Secure World Foundation does a publication every year on counter space capabilities, using publicly available data to show that there is a development in a lot of the technology to try and target satellites for disruption or potentially destruction. I've also recently, as you all know, participated in the putting together of a paper with Ben Silverstein and John Borey of UNIDIR, and we actually analyze indicators of a potential arms race in outer space. So it's great to see that the UK government is putting forward a new initiative to try and look at maybe some of the solutions that could be available to us. And so with that, I would like to introduce Ambassador Aidan Liddle, an old friend now. Ambassador Liddle, he is the ambassador and permanent representative to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. He was appointed in 2018. He joined the Foreign Commonwealth Office in 2003. And during the course of his career, he has served as a deputy head of mission at the British Embassy in Stockholm, at the EU Internal Department, as head of the South African section and private secretary to the permanent undersecretary in London. It's a very impressive CV. And so I would also like to congratulate him, as the UK resolution passed yesterday in the General Assembly. And so we'd now like to hear from him about what this resolution is, what it could mean for future work on space security, and what the next steps might be. So with that, Ambassador, take it away.
Thank you so much, Daniel. It's brilliant to be with you virtually it's afternoon here in Geneva, or wherever whatever the time, wherever you are. Thank you very much to you, Daniel, for putting this event together. Thanks to Space Court Foundation and Secure World Foundation as well. It's really good to have the opportunity to be able to talk about this. And thanks in advance as well to my extremely distinguished fellow panelists. It's really great to be sharing a virtual stage with you all. As you say, this is quite a timely session. So the resolution, which we gave the snappy title, "Reducing Space Threats Through Norms, Rules, and Principles of Responsible Behaviours," passed the first committee just over a month ago, at the beginning of November. And was adopted formally by the General Assembly in New York yesterday afternoon. We had 164 votes in favour, with 12 against and 6 abstentions. So we were really, really pleased to see a really wide range of support from across the UN membership for this initiative. So it's now an official UN General Assembly resolution. The number isn't actually yet up on the system, which is really annoying, but I think it's going to be 75/38. But anyway, I'm probably the only one who gets excited about that sort of thing. Before I say more about what the resolution does, I think it might be worth just sort of saying a bit about the state of space security diplomacy and why we thought the time was right for a new approach. Daniel, you've already touched on some of it in your introduction, but I think it might be worth just spending a bit of time on that because it's important background. So I think that the first thing to say is that there are some fundamental rules that govern peace and security in outer space. The UN Charter itself applies in outer space. There's some controversy about exactly how, but I think everybody accepts that it does. There has been some progress on establishing guidelines for safe and sustainable operations in space as well. So already back in 1959, which was only 2 years after the launch of Sputnik, the UN set up a committee on the peaceful uses of outer space, UN COPUOS, which sits in Vienna. And UN COPUOS agreed a series of important conventions in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And for our purposes, I think the most important of those is the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which, amongst other things, bans the placement of weapons of mass destruction in orbit or on celestial bodies. The 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty already prohibited nuclear tests in space, but this was the first one to talk about weapons in space. The latest thing COPUOS did was last year to adopt 21 guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space activities. But really what COPUOS focuses on is safety and sustainability and the peaceful uses of outer space, the civilian uses of outer space. But obviously the Outer Space Treaty from 1967 has sort of important guidelines on military activities as well. Military uses of space really falls under the purview of the Conference on Disarmament, which I'm accredited to here in Geneva, and the UN General Assembly's first committee, which we've mentioned already. And in the early to mid 1980s, both the Conference on Disarmament and the UNGA First Committee started discussions on PAROS, on preventing an arms race in outer space, which Daniel mentioned. And this was really motivated by the prospect of not WMD, but conventional weapons being deployed in space. And I think after many, many years of fairly circular discussions, I think the main initiative in this field up until now, I would say, was the proposal for a draft treaty prohibiting the placement of weapons in outer space, which was proposed by China and Russia at the Conference on Disarmament in 2014. Or the most recent version was tabled in 2014. The CD never agreed to launch formal negotiations on this draft. The group of government experts that Daniel so expertly supported to consider the whole question of a legally binding instrument on outer space broke up without agreement in 2019. This sort of line of work has never really sort of taken off. But I think it's probably worth exploring the reasons why that is in a bit more detail before we get on to what we're trying to do with our new initiative. I suppose the first problem that we and many others see with the particularly the PPWT, but I think the whole that whole sort of line of work is that it ignores the problems of effectively verifying the capabilities of objects in orbit or in dealing with dual-use systems. And while our space situational awareness technology is getting good at tracking the behavior of objects in outer space, we don't yet have the technical means to ascertain the capabilities of objects once they're in orbit. And frankly, I don't think there's any prospect of states allowing blanket inspection, on-site inspections of objects before they get launched into space. We certainly wouldn't do that, and I don't expect anybody else would either. But I think even if there were a prospect of that sort of inspection regime, it wouldn't help with the fact that space objects designed for perfectly legitimate civilian purposes can also be used to disrupt or destroy other objects in space once they're up there. For example, a satellite with a grappling arm or a harpoon to drag space debris out of congested orbits, such as the ones that the University of Surrey have been developing, could also be used to knock a military communication satellite out of position. So the line between what is a perfectly legitimate and very welcome civilian capability and what's a military capability is a pretty thin one. Now, this dual-use problem isn't a new problem in disarmament diplomacy. We deal with this problem in chemical and biological weapons, for example. But I think the stakes are higher in space, partly because of the nature of the environment, because objects are out of reach of inspection once they're launched, and of course, because of the potential consequences of miscalculation, which I'll come on to in a bit. So that's the sort of first set of problems with this legally binding approach. The second problem is that it, specifically with the PPWT, the Russian and Chinese draft, is that it largely ignores the fact that threats to space systems don't just or even primarily emanate from kinetic weapons in space. That's not to say that those threats aren't present or serious, because they are. But it's also important when you're considering the whole range of threats to space systems is to look at ground-based anti-satellite capabilities, which many states have demonstrated already, threats to ground stations or communications links between ground stations and space objects, and various techniques for temporarily or permanently disabling a space object through means such as cyber, electronic, or directed energy, which stop short of physically destroying a satellite and creating debris, but obviously disable it or put it out of action either temporarily or permanently. And I think the main sort of lesson to take away from this is that we can only avoid weaponizing space if we manage threats from the Earth too. You can't look at the different domains in isolation. So alongside the PPWT initiative, there have been two other strands of work in space security diplomacy which don't take a legally binding treaty as their goal, or at least not explicitly. One was a draft international code of conduct for outer space activities, which the European Union began work on back in 2008. But that sort of hit the buffers in 2015 in the face of some pretty concerted opposition from many different players on both substance and process grounds. So that really hasn't gone anywhere in the last 5 years or so. The other strand of work is the various UN mandated efforts dating back to the early 1990s, I think, to develop transparency and confidence building measures, or TCBMs, in outer space. That came up with a set of voluntary TCBMs being drawn up by another UN group of governmental experts and adopted by the General Assembly back in 2013. So that is something that exists and was adopted by consensus and is widely acknowledged to be a good piece of work. But again, it was only voluntary, and TCBMs really only go so far. It's as much about transparency and communication as setting rules of the road, as it were. So there have been things going on, but of course, as so often, developments have rather outpaced UN diplomacy. I think I mean, this audience will be very familiar with the reasons with what's been going on in space over the last few years. But I think, you know, it's important to recognise a few which are particularly important here. One of which, of course, is the number of space actors. You know, back in the 70s, when these issues were first being talked about in terms of security, it was really a US-Soviet discussion. There weren't really any other serious space players. Today, there are at least 30, I would say, spacefaring nations. Many more have realistic aspirations to become spacefaring nations in the not too distant future. And as I'll say a bit more about later, almost every country depends on space-based systems, really, in some sense, whether it's communications, position, navigation, and timing, all sorts of other things. I suppose the other thing is the fact that space is becoming increasingly congested, not just by the increase of spacefaring nations, but because of the rise of commercial actors, non-state actors in space. There are, of course, a huge number of objects going up into space every year. States are developing access-denying technology, and of course, there's a lot of there is competition and congestion in space, involving not just states and militaries, but increasingly now civilian commercial operators. And in fact, it's probably civilian commercial operators who are in the forefront of space now, rather than militaries as before. And I would say that poses two main challenges, really, from a security perspective. And the first is, as I suggested just now, is that because states depend on space systems for their civilian and their economic life, as well as their military operations, space systems are now part of states' critical national infrastructure. And that means that they represent a point of vulnerability, which can be exploited by adversaries in a crisis. And it means that the states that depend on them have a legitimate interest in protecting and defending those systems. And that comes back to what I was saying earlier on about needing to look at the sort of vulnerability of space systems when you're looking at weaponization. I suppose the second challenge from a security perspective is that the existence of these vulnerabilities and the existence of these sorts of ambiguous dual use capabilities that I was talking about earlier can lead to heightened tensions between states. And that in itself can lead to a sort of vicious circle of escalation, both in space and on Earth. Now, this isn't necessarily new, but the pace of technological change and the rapid growth in the number and diversity of actors in space makes the risks of misunderstanding or miscalculation between space actors increasingly dangerous, and I would say urgent. If a state doesn't understand or misinterprets the maneuvers of a potential adversary's space object near a sensitive system of their own, or isn't sure what capabilities it might possess, you can see how the situation could escalate. So, as I said, I think the conclusion that we drew from all of that is that if we want the space environment to remain peaceful, protected, accessible, and free from conflict, then we need a new approach to space security. So that leads me on to the UK's resolution. So our idea really for breaking this deadlock was to look at the drivers for an arms race in outer space from a different angle. As Daniel said, I don't think anyone would deny that there is at least the beginnings of an arms race, or the condition for an arms race, in place at the moment. But trying to separate space from Earth and different systems is pretty nonsensical. So if we're looking at the drivers of that race, it's not, you know, we need to look at things from a different angle. And I would suggest that our resolution departs from previous attempts to do this in three main ways. The first way is that we focus on behaviors, not objects. So the traditional sort of arms control, disarmament diplomacy approach is to look at objects or capabilities. So we put qualitative and quantitative controls on systems to remove the need for competition. That sort of traditional object-based approach, as I was suggesting earlier, hasn't got us very far. The other way of looking at what drives arms races is not looking at the adversary's capabilities and trying to match them or counter them. It's to look at the behaviors or actions of the various parties that might exacerbate tensions and drive competition, and therefore fuel the need to develop new capabilities. that approach for us, as well as sort of being a perfectly sensible way of looking at arms racing, also has the benefit, I think, particularly for space, of not getting tied up in the verification and definitional issues that I touched on earlier. So this isn't about trying to define what is an object in what is a weapon in space, or to look at verification regimes and that sort of thing, which the object approach leads you to pretty quickly. But you can use this behavioral framing to get into a conversation which covers all states' legitimate concerns, and thereby hopefully leads to a process whereby you can identify common ground and look for solutions. So that's the first difference in our approach. The second is that, in contrast from other initiatives which have been tried from time to time, this is an organic bottom-up approach. So we take as our starting point the threats and challenges that exist today. We acknowledge that different problems will lend themselves to different solutions. And rather than suggesting a sort of comprehensive top-down legal framework, which is what other both legal and non-legally binding proposals have tried to do, we try and sort of look at the problem from the bottom up and do it in an organic way. And I suppose the important thing to emphasize in that is that this process doesn't presuppose or rule in or out any particular outcome. It is not aiming at a particular instrument or a particular format or a particular set of issues. The idea of a legally binding treaty is still very important to a lot of member states, and we have to recognize that. This work is perfectly capable with that ambition, but it doesn't predetermine that as an outcome. If it looks from this conversation like there are certain problems that lend themselves to being solved by a legally binding treaty or by some other mechanism, those options are left open from the start, which I think is important. The third main difference is that we wanted to get away from the idea that this is an issue that primarily concerns the spacefaring nations, and particularly what you might call the great sort of space powers or the military space powers. I think that's perhaps it's never been explicitly stated, but I think it's been implicit in the way that the UN and the Conference on Disarmament has approached these issues for decades. That this is a sort of one for the big powers, and everybody else just sort of has to come along. I think for the reasons I was saying earlier, this is no longer something that the P5 or the spacefaring powers can sort out amongst themselves. There are plenty of big spacefaring powers who are sort of outside those traditional arms control mechanisms. There are plenty of very influential actors who aren't spacefaring nations at all. Some of them might aspire to be, others don't. But I think the most important thing to realize is that really, if this is a question about collective security, as I suggested earlier, really every state has a stake in this, because every state depends on space for their security, both economic and physical security, if you like. So as well as having a process that involved everybody in coming up with solutions and identifying threats and concerns, we also wanted to start a process which would also create a better collective understanding of the current threats to space security and the implications for all states, whatever their capabilities and aspirations in space. That's partly a trust and confidence building measure in its own right, I think, but it's also, I think, a way forward, because if we all fail to understand the motivations and aspirations of every other state, then we're just going to go around in circles as we have done before. So that's the sort of the conceptual framing, if you like, of the new resolution. In terms of what the resolution actually does, frankly, it just seeks to start a conversation. It's no more ambitious than that, really. There are sort of 3 or 4 key provisions, I would say. One is that states are just invited to start a conversation about it. Operative paragraph 4, for example, invites states that already have space defense policies or space security policies to present them formally in various fora, the Conference on Disarmament or the UN Disarmament Commission or wherever else. That's again a transparency measure, and it's to encourage dialogue. In operative paragraph 5, we encourage member states to start doing the work themselves to understand these issues. A lot of these issues are new to a lot of states, or a lot of these issues haven't been on the table in this way before. So in operative paragraph 5, we ask member states to study existing and potential threats and security risks to space systems, including those arising from actions, activities, or systems in outer space or on Earth. We ask them to characterize actions and activities that could be considered responsible, irresponsible, or threatening, and assess their impact. And we ask them to share their ideas on the further development and implementation of norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors, which might reduce risks of misunderstanding and miscalculation. So that's sort of setting the homework, if you like, for all of the UN member states. And in operative paragraph 6, the General Assembly asks member states to submit their views on these issues once they've studied them to the UN Secretary General, and it asks the UN Secretary General to compile a report which analyzes the submissions from member states and makes recommendations back to the General Assembly on future work. And then finally, in operative paragraph 7, we create a new agenda item on the General Assembly's agenda next year under the overall prevention of an arms race in outer space agenda item, which gives this process a sort of institutional home to develop over the coming years. So the resolution was adopted yesterday, and so these provisions will start to kick in very soon. We expect the Secretary General to write to member states in January to request their views with a deadline in May. The Secretary General will then write the report, or I expect he'll have his people do it for him. That report will come out in August, and that'll be in time for the next General Assembly First Committee session in October. So what we're going to be focusing on as the UK now over the next few months is to work with member states to make sure as many as possible submit their views to this report, because it's really important to us that a broad range of member states engages with this process and submits their views. So we're planning a number of events in the first half of next year to sort of workshop these ideas, talk them through, trying to understand each other's perspectives, and to help states think through what they want to see in that report. We're also going to be putting our own national report, national submission together as early as possible to sort of help stimulate conversation. Perhaps just a few final thoughts before I finish, which we might sort of pick up more in the discussion. I think the first thing to say is that we want people to understand that this initiative is about space threats. This is about threats to space systems. It's not about space weather. It's not about reducing debris. It's not about sort of rules of the road for commercial operators. They're all incredibly important for preserving space, the space environment. They also have knock-on effects to security, by the way. But our focus on this is primarily on threats to space systems and the implications that those threats have for strategic stability and for the security of states on Earth. This is about avoiding conflict, first and foremost. Second, and Daniel, you sort of alluded to the fact that you've had previous conversations about this, so I won't go into it in too much detail, but these are real problems. Nations are still developing anti-satellite missiles and lasers that can destroy sensors on satellites. We see the use of jamming equipment that impacts on civilian air and maritime traffic, as well as on military systems. Some of the activities that you can see developing in space might sort of impact on nuclear systems, command and control or early warning sensors. This is serious stuff. If a nuclear weapon state has its early warning capabilities messed about with to think the nuclear strike is coming, that matters. That matters for everybody. So these are incredibly important issues, but it also underlines why you need to take a very holistic view of all of this. You can't just look at sort of different vectors or different aspects of the infrastructure in isolation. So I think that's probably all I need to say. I mean, I think this is important work, but it's really only the beginning. And I really hope that this process of dialogue and conversation, it's important for its own sake, but I really hope that over the years to come, this is going to lead to a serious discussion about what we might do to try and mitigate these threats and reduce the risks of conflict, and reduce the risks of miscalculation and misunderstanding. And that's got to be a good thing for all of us. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. That was a very thorough presentation, and like I said, a lot of the things that you're saying and that you're just the starting off point, I think, is really good news for those of us who have been working in this field, because we do want to see the conversation moving, and we want to make sure that that there are some legitimate efforts going towards focused, tangible measures that could actually improve security in space. And this is a great way to get things started. So we're always in favor of having a good conversation. I've got tons of questions for you, but you know what? I am going to defer, and I'm very proud to say that we have an all-lady panel of experts to talk with us today. In the American parlance, I think we would call this a murderer's row, just because they are all at the top of their game. And well, I don't envy whoever's on the other end of their barrage of questions. So I would like to start out, just to remind everybody of a quick format. I'm going to introduce each one of our expert panelists, give them an opportunity to make a quick statement, and then ask the ambassador a question. And then after that, we'll switch back over to Q&A and try to take some of the questions from the audience. I would also like to remind everyone, we are living in a COVID world, which means everyone is at home. Some people have puppies, some people have kids. These things happen. Sorry about that, Your Excellency, just in case the little critters start yelling at each other. But I would like to start off first with my colleague, Ms. Victoria Sampson, the Washington Office Director of the Secure World Foundation, again, also one of my old friends. She's co-editor of the Counter Space Assessment that is done every year, and she is an expert in this field. She started off doing a lot of work on missiles in the first place, and so she also understands the importance of space systems to other military, to the wider military capabilities. So, Victoria, please.
Thank you, Daniel. I'd like to say hello, everyone, and thank you, Ambassador Liddle, for that really interesting overview. And I'd like to extend my congratulations to the United Kingdom for the successful passage of this resolution. Recognizing that time is an issue, let's start with just making the point that outer space activities are more important than ever. Any significant interruption, whether it's deliberate or even implied, could have serious implications for national security and social and economic ripple effects. This creates both opportunities and challenges that require timely policy responses and a concerted approach in multilateral fora like the United Nations. Since 2005, there have been 20 anti-satellite weapons tests in space or against satellites by 4 different countries, a rate of testing that has not happened since the 1960s. In addition to outright weapons testing, there have been a growing number of concerning activities in space. Many of these concern rendezvous and proximity operations or deliberate close approaches of other space objects by satellites. There's a growing concern that such activities might increase tensions between countries or could be misinterpreted as hostile actions that precipitate an armed attack. Various multilateral fora have discussed current space security challenges, but these discussions focusing on a legally binding approach have yielded very limited progress. Our approach to space security and stability has not been working. We need to change it before the changing space domain precipitates a crisis, unintended or otherwise. Ambassador Liddle mentioned the PPWT, and that, as well as the proposal for no first placement of weapons in space, have not had much traction. I'd like to point out between 2017 and 2019, 3 different UN bodies tried and failed to create any significant progress on space security issues in multilateral setting, again, talking about it from mostly a legally binding approach. The Group of Governmental Experts on Paros, CD Subsidiary Body 3, and the UN Disarmament Commission. There needs to be a recognition that there is no silver bullet for solving the core space security challenges. They are complex. They'll require multiple approaches that involve both voluntary and legally binding efforts that work together as part of a comprehensive whole. You need both halves of that issue, voluntary and legally binding. There are a number of concepts and issues that can serve as a starting point to further discussion on developing a substantive framework to enhance space security and stability. It is time that all possible options to bolster international strategic stability and space security are fully explored. And that's why things like this UK resolution is such a welcome change to how we've been approaching ensuring space security and stability. So with that, I'd like to ask Ambassador Liddle, space security and stability has long been viewed as an issue that primarily affects the superpowers and established space actors. How do we make sure this discussion of responsible space behavior is relevant to the emerging space actors and space data users? And along those lines, how do you massage concerns that the mandate of responsible behavior won't put an undue burden on the emerging space world? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, as I alluded to earlier, I think this has too long been seen as you know, something for the sort of the big powers to sort out amongst themselves. And I think for the reasons I said, that's it's certainly not legitimate now if it ever was. I think I mean, our work leading up to this resolution has underlined for us really that a lot of states are sort of really getting to grips with this problem now. So as part of our preparation for this resolution, we ran a series of Wilton Park workshops, so sort of conferences in various regions of the world, in Africa, Latin America, Asia. And I think, you know, the message we got from there was that people really are sort of focused on the importance of space systems and the reliance they place on space systems, but hadn't perhaps necessarily made the link to national security from that. So, you know, people are looking at it from a sort of peaceful uses point of view and a technological point of view, but not necessarily from, you know, what does that mean for your security? So I hope that part of this resolution, part of the benefits of this resolution is it starts that conversation going and it builds that awareness of the different sort of threats and vulnerabilities that are out there. I mean, in our consultations, this idea about the sort of, you know, making sure that space is a domain for peaceful uses was really important. And, you know, another of the implications of the Outer Space Treaty is that, you know, this is a domain which has got to be kept open and accessible for all. This is a common domain, a global commons. So, you know, we've been very careful to say that this is about maintaining access to space. It's certainly not about trying to restrict it. I think, you know, the reason for doing this in a collective way is precisely to avoid the problem about sort of being seen to impose rules or burdens on others and raising the barrier to entry. You know, as I say, this is about trying to keep space open, and I think you know, I'm sure that will come out in the SecGen report and inform the future direction of this process.
Thank you, Ambassador. That was a great question also from Victoria. Up next, a dear friend of mine, Dr. Raji Rajagopalan. Raji is a distinguished fellow and head of the Nuclear and Space Policy Initiative at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. She was also one of the in-house experts for the group of governmental experts on the prevention of an arms race in outer space. She and I went through a lot throughout that process. And so I'm sure she also has a stimulating question for you, Ambassador. So with that, Raji, fire away.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you to Ambassador for the very straightforward, but it's very crystal clear in that sense, outlining the resolution as of now. And I think this is a welcome break because I think you have had PPWT as one particular option for a very long time. And the main question was, what is the alternative? Okay, you don't like PPWT, but what's the alternative? And so in a sense, I think the UK's step to coming up with this proposal, I think that's a very welcome thing, and also provides us an alternative because I think PPWT or even NFP, the EU ICOG, none of this have led us to the favorable destination. So in a sense, we need to see what went wrong. And I think that's an important, because I think when you look at space, in a sense, it has become so important in our lives, but at the same time, some of the recent developments, and especially in the security sector, are very, very damaging with serious consequences. So unless we take certain measures to restrain and restrict the kind of activities that we engage in space, our access to space will not be safe, secure, or guaranteed in a sense. And there have been, like you said, you outlined very clearly some of the very recent developments over the last decade or so. But like I said, none of these have led to very clear sort of a favorable outcome. But I think that is primarily because to me the biggest challenge facing the development of an outer space regime is the lack of consensus among the major powers, and I think that's the key problem. And these are essentially political impediments. They are not technical or legal issues. They are political issues, and therefore that much harder to resolve in some ways. But I think this also comes from the fact that there are major power relations today are characterized by a serious lack of confidence and trust in each other. The trust that is so absent in today's political relations among major powers has become a big problem in this. And therefore, I would say, even though your proposal, you don't really look at one particular outcome or one particular format as the outcome of this process, but I think we need, in the first instance, measures that would strengthen trust and confidence in each other. And again, TCBMs have proven to be one good measure to go about, because they are essentially an intermediate step between a functional need of regulating space and finding a binding instrument, developing a binding instrument. We have witnessed a number of debates in this regard on the need for binding and non-binding measures. They haven't had much success so far, but I think TCBMs can essentially tackle that one particular issue, which is the biggest challenge today of political issues. And I think, therefore, because TCBMs are simply ways to strengthen dialogue, openness, greater transparency, and information sharing in a sense. And of course, these are voluntary in nature, but this can also sort of increase the attraction for confidence in each other. And I think that's an important aspect which we haven't generally seen. And I think there are several advantages and, of course, some disadvantages as well. Advantages being these are voluntary commitments and therefore easier to reach a political agreement in a sense. There could be sufficient interest in all sides about the possibilities of an agreement. That is something that you can work out, but at least in the first instance, develop the kind of trust and confidence in each other. TCBMs precisely do this particular. Second, there are no complications as to what is that you're agreeing to, what is that going to be enforced, verified, and so on and so forth. There are no extended sort of a legislative process and so on and so forth. But there is a disadvantage to many of the people, many of the folks who are against the TCBMs, that it can be broken without any penalties and so on and so forth. But to me, one single advantage outweighs the disadvantage, that these are excellent measures targeting the political aspects of addressing outer space challenges, and that is important. And these are excellent platforms. It opens up dialogues and periodic interactions between states, and precisely what your proposal seeks to do. I think so. Therefore, we should have an end goal of developing more binding instruments. But in today's political and security environment, reaching a political consensus among states are going to be difficult. But I think we need to invest a great deal in developing trust in each other as the first point. And the UK proposal not looking at one particular format is a very encouraging sign. And more importantly, you have an alternative to PPWT or the EUICOC in a sense. My quick one question I wanted to ask you is, we have had two GGs in recent years, the 2013 TCBMs and the 2019 non-PAROs. But of course, you have also seen the worsening political climate by the turn of the second GG, to the point where there is not even a consensus report. The divisions appear to have become much sharper. So I would like to understand from you, what are the kind of various steps that you might have taken by the UK government, in a sense, to narrow down the differences and to build greater support for the UK proposal. Again, thank you and best wishes on your proposal. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I mean, just before I answer the question, I think it's a really good point on TCBMs. And I think what we're trying to do is sort of very much build on the work that's been done on TCBMs, but then sort of look to see where we can move beyond it. Because I think, you know, there's wide appreciation for the role that TCBMs can play. But as you suggest, they're a sort of necessary but not sufficient tool really for what we're trying to do. So it's sort of bridging the gap really sort of away, you know, building on TCBMs and moving towards a more normative process, which is what we're trying to do. Yeah, it's no secret that the political climate is pretty ordinary right now. It's very difficult to get consensus on anything, and it's difficult to have a conversation based on trust, which I think is why our resolution is so important. But it's also, you know, it also means that there are quite a lot of headwinds that we need to navigate as well. I mentioned earlier that 164 states supported that, and that's brilliant. And it includes a lot of states who have existing or future aspirations in space, and a lot of states who've been engaged in these issues. from all over the world. We had support from really strong support from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia, as well as from Europe and North America, and that's really important to us. But I think we also have to recognise that 12 states voted against. States like Russia, China, Iran, DPRK, who all have space capabilities of various degrees. And there were a handful of states who abstained as well, and in particular India and Israel, who again are major space players and whose views matter in this. And so I think the first important thing to say is that we engaged everybody in working up this proposal, including and in particular Russia and China. We worked really hard with them and with India to sort of explain what we were trying to do and to get their buy-in. It obviously wasn't enough this time round, but I think our hope is that those states will at least engage with the process. Just because they didn't support the resolution doesn't mean to say they can't submit their national contributions to the Secretary General's report. And I would really hope they do that, because it's really important to understand why those states didn't see this as a worthwhile exercise, and to try and persuade them that there is some merit in it. So we will carry on working with them and talking to them and engaging with them and trying to keep open that space for dialogue, because I think it's really important.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador. Up next, we have Ali Stickings. Ali Stickings is the Research Fellow for Space Policy and Security. As you are a fellow countryman of the Ambassador, and coming from the UK perspective, I think we'd have a lot to hear from you, in particular in the context of this particular resolution in wider UK policies on space at the moment.
Great, thank you, Daniel. And Ambassador, thank you so much for your remarks as well. Yeah, I'm going to just put this in a little bit of context of the UK and what's happening at the moment. The UK is currently undergoing what's called the integrated review, and this is a major review across the UK's defence, national security and foreign policy objectives. And of course, space is something that cuts across all of that. So it's important to understand this in that broader context. And similarly, we're seeing quite a lot happening with space in the UK in terms of ambition. The current UK government has been very clear about its desire to increase the UK space ambition, and at the same time increase the UK's standing internationally as a space power, while still understanding it's a medium space power and doesn't have the capabilities or the budgets necessarily to compete with the major powers. And we've seen this in a number of ways, particularly the appointment of a director of space for the UK Ministry of Defence, and also the forthcoming Space Command. And I'm aware that the announcement of a Space Command probably has caused some confusion. On the one hand, you see the UK, putting forward this resolution, and it's about, being responsible. And of course, a Space Command, can lead some to perhaps think this means the UK is now going to be developing, very sophisticated counter space capabilities and start to engage in those. So again, we need to understand where the UK is coming from. And I think also, something the ambassador said about not looking at space in isolation, and also not looking at this resolution in isolation, and understanding how it cuts, across all those different aspects of defense and national security, and you can't really separate the military from these discussions. I think sometimes it's easy to see this as being mutually exclusive, as saying the military is doing this, and they're not going to be engaged or not wanting to discuss some of these other conversations that we're having. And I think what we see with this new resolution actually can start to bridge that divide, because it isn't about preventing militarization or weaponization. I mean, I've argued that that's already happened, and it's more about accepting this reality. And I think the focus on behaviors is very important. Instead of saying we need to prevent satellites with RPO capabilities, it's about that behavior. And how do we understand threat? And therefore, how does the military need to react? How does the military say we are now threatened and we might respond? And it's something that is, threatening that, as well as long-term sustainability. And militaries are invested in long-term sustainability. They don't want to lose access to space because of their reliance on it. So I really think that this, this resolution and the way we're now approaching it can help to bridge that divide, and can help to create, bring those communities together, because we can't do it without everyone's involvement. So I think my question for the ambassador is to come back to that UK context and really think, what's your opinion on, or what's your view on how the work that you've been doing does sit within the UK's broader ambitions, both for space, but also with the integrated review, and how it can link up with what else is happening, perhaps to give it even more emphasis.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something that's sort of been rising up the agenda in the UK over the last few years. Last year, we announced that we're going to be setting up, well, we have set up a new National Space Council, and that sort of speaks to some of the issues you're bringing up, in that it brings together, yes, the commercial and civilian bits of space, which through the UK Space Agency and the Department for Business. But it also brings together the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence as well. So that's a way really of us domestically trying to sort of reconcile the commercial and economic aspirations we have as a sort of emerging space player. We're looking at a commercial launch capability in the UK in the coming years. We're developing our sort of national expertise in particularly in small commercial satellite technology, but also looking at the sort of security implications for space as well. So we're doing that in our sort of domestic structures, and as you say, the integrated review will sort of put more flesh on the bones of that, I think, and set out our strategy and our interest in a slightly longer term way. It's also, I think, worth looking at what's happening in NATO. NATO has also declared space an operational domain. What it means by that is not, as you say, this like Space Command, this is not about sort of Moonraker style space army or anything like that. This is about sort of it's about recognizing that space is an enabling domain for security on Earth. It's about sort of understanding the role that space plays in terms of what I was talking about earlier, communications, positioning, navigation, early warning, all that sort of thing. And of course, if you have that infrastructure, you need to defend it like any other military capability. But defending something and protecting something doesn't just mean developing a sort of weapons capability around it. It also means developing norms and rules. What I do as a disarmament diplomat is to try and put norms and rules around the uses of weapons and the uses of military technology and the conduct of war. And I suppose what we're doing in space is an extension of that, in that we are talking about how to reach a common understanding as a global community about what is and isn't acceptable in space, recognizing that we all have these aims and objectives. So I think I hope it's all sort of one of a piece, really, but it certainly, as you say, highlights the sort of the greater interest in the UK, and I think in lots of other sort of comparable mid-level states across the world in these sorts of issues.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think that's a really excellent remark as well about the place of diplomacy within the wider context for national security. Secure World Foundation actually just made some recommendations to the Biden administration precisely on this point and the important role of diplomacy, as well as other types of developments. Okay, finally, and this could be our big hitter, Jessica West, senior researcher with Project Plowshares. She's also in charge of all their space studies and has been doing some really excellent work recently on the development of norms and what are some possible areas that we can be looking at for some tangible measures. She's also come up with some of the best terminology I've seen in a while on space security, including taking the low-hanging fruit and making fruit salad. So with that, Jessica, please.
Yes, well, I would be remiss if I didn't start by pointing out that 4 decades is really too long to wait for concrete collective security measures in space. When I put that in perspective, I realized that my organization, Project Plowshares, has been engaged in this field for roughly the same amount of time, and we've seen significant progress in almost every other arms control file except for space. So I fully understand the frustration that many feel who are following this file, particularly the stalemate or tug of war between norms on one hand and hardware approaches to security on the other. So on that note, I really appreciate this resolution. And particularly because we've been hearing refrains repeatedly over the years calling for norms, but we haven't really seen any concrete proposals offered. And that, to me, risked making norms sort of a rhetorical device. And I think norms are so much more than rhetoric. Personally, I approach norms as the hygiene of international security. And during a global pandemic, I think we can all appreciate the value of good hygiene even while we wait for a vaccine. So how do we get there? Recently, my work has been focused on this question, on how we can build on the recent successful efforts to identify best practices related to safety and sustainability and start thinking about security concerns. But it turns out that security norms aren't quite as straightforward as hand washing. To succeed, norms must be inclusive and fair. They must be rooted in shared values and principles and expectations, and they really have to extend beyond the like-minded to include the other-minded. And I think this is where the UK initiative really gets off to a good start. But looking down the road, implementation must also be inclusive and fair. Norms also need mechanisms in place to make implementation possible, to make the conduct of good behavior possible. This problem of missing mechanisms, such as verification, is often used to derail arms control efforts. But norms also require mechanisms. The premise is that they inform individual action, but most efforts to reduce threats and misperceptions involve communication and engagement with others. And so processes for verification and accountability are also important. So my question is really focused on how we move the resolution forward beyond the discussion, which is the starting point, and the report that will hopefully come out of this process to the next step. A key source of deadlock in the first committee has been competing perspectives and different prioritizations of threats. And some states have expressed concerns that, unlike their perceptions of safety and sustainability, they see a focus on responsible behavior and perceptions of threats as subjective. So how will you grapple with potentially competing interpretations going forward? And what else is needed? Are there practical tools or mechanisms that you might identify as helpful or feasible to facilitate the emergence of a shared perspective going forward, and also actual implementation of good behavior? Thank you.
Wow, there's loads in there. We could probably spend the rest of the afternoon talking about those things. But I think there's probably sort of three things I'd really pick up from that. First is this whole sort of question about norms. I mean, the resolution talks about norms, rules, and principles. And, in certain ways, you could see those three words as being sort of slightly interchangeable or synonymous. I don't think they are. And they're sort of deliberately chosen really to be sort of to be inclusive and to give you lots of cover for what you might want to do, but they are very specific types of process. For me, and there's lots of dispute, by the way, about exactly what all of these different terms mean, but for me, a norm is something that emerges not quite sort of naturally, but it's something, it's a sort of a generally accepted standard or way of behaving, which you can then codify later. So I'm not one of the people who believes that you can sort of declare a norm by fiat. I think a norm is something that you codify later, but you do so on the basis of a sort of existing consensus that there is a particular way of behaving or a particular sort of goal that we need to achieve. And so I think one of the things I hope comes out of this process is that we can sort of have a discussion about what sort of ways of behaving in space already sort of command that sort of common ground, that sort of norm or pre-norm sort of status, which you can then go on and codify. And that comes on to the next thing you were talking about then what do you sort of what processes do you put in place? So I think once you've got a norm, you can then codify it. That becomes a rule, and the rules then have the sort of enforcement mechanisms, verification, institutional apparatus that goes around it. I mean, we're not there yet, obviously, but I think this process is definitely designed to try and move, at least in some areas. And as I said earlier, this isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all. This is something where different aspects of the problem might lend themselves to a norm, to a rule, to a principle, or even to a sort of legally binding treaty. So I think this is designed to give us scope to do all of those different things. On the sort of the other point I'll pick up is the subjectivity point, because this is something that came up a lot in the consultations on the resolution. You know, some states who ended up supporting it and some states who didn't raised concerns about whether sort of responsible behavior itself was a subjective concept. We talk in the resolution about perceptions of threats, you know, whether these sorts of concepts have any place in arms control processes in the UN. I mean, we're unashamed to say that yes, they are subjective, but that they matter. And in a way, it's more important to talk about these things precisely because they are subjective. You know, if I have a space object and a state with which I have difficult relations park something next to it, then, you know, the way I react to that is necessarily subjective because I have no idea what that object is, what it's going to do, what it's not going to do. You know, that my subjective perception of that threat is going to drive my own behavior, and that leads to the sort of escalation patterns that we were talking about earlier. So I think it's really important to talk about subjective issues because that's how you get to understand what sort of behaviors are helpful or not helpful, and I think that's where you might get into that sort of norm setting process about how you then put some boundaries around that.
Fantastic, Jessica. You didn't disappoint. That was quite a question. Many thanks again to everyone, Jessica, Raji, Ali, Ambassador, particular to your good self. Thank you for giving us an hour of your time. Victoria, is there anything you would like to say in closing as our co-host?
Yes, again, thank you everyone for their participation and insights. Two quick things. We had a discussion about the need to understand the nature of the threat. Daniel brought up Secure World's Counter Space Threat Assessment. I'd like to point out it is available on our website, and we have the executive summary is in French and Spanish, as well as the whole thing is available in English. So that is a resource we'd love people to check out if they're interested. The other thing is I'd like to point out that later on today, actually, at 1400 or 2 p.m. Eastern Time, Secure World will be having an event release for our Space Policy and Sustainability Briefing for the incoming Biden administration. And that's where we have about a briefing document where we give recommendations in everything from national security to SSA to China to mega constellations to space weather to planetary defense. We encourage anyone who's interested to see what we think the next U.S. administration to be focusing on. Please come check it out. Busy day for everyone. And I'd just like to thank everyone for participating and look forward to seeing you at the next SWF event. And I'm sure Space Corp Foundation will be happy with their next one as well. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you very much, everybody. Take care.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Stay safe, everybody. Take care.